They burned the records. They buried the names. They rewrote the story so completely that for 500 years, an entire continent believed the lie. But here's the thing about blood. You cannot burn it. You cannot bury it. You cannot rewrite what is already written inside every single cell of every single person walking the streets of Bogotá, Medellín, Cartagena, and Cali right now. And when a group of geneticists finally sat down with their machines and their data and their cold, brutal science, they discovered something that made one researcher literally push back his chair, stand up, and walk out of the room without saying a single word. Not because the results were wrong, but because they were so right that it shattered everything. This is the story of Colombia, not the Colombia of coffee and emeralds and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Colombia that existed long before any of those things had a name. Subscribe right now, because what comes next will change the way you see this country forever. Let us start not with a date, not with a name, but with a feeling. Imagine you are standing on a narrow strip of land, and on your left, an entire ocean is breathing. On your right, another ocean is breathing. Above you, mountains so tall they touch the clouds. Below you, jungle so thick and so alive that it feels like the earth itself is watching you. This is not a metaphor. This is the geography of Colombia. And for tens of thousands of years, this land did something that almost no other place on earth could do. It connected everything, north to south, ocean to ocean, civilization to civilization. Geographers call it a bridge. But that word is too small. Colombia was not a bridge. Colombia was a gate. And through that gate, wave after wave after wave of human beings passed. Some walking slowly, some running for their lives, some conquering, some being conquered, some simply searching for a place where the ground was soft enough to plant something and call it home. And here is where the story gets complicated, because the people who passed through that gate did not leave footprints. They left something far more permanent. They left their DNA, and DNA, unlike footprints, unlike books, unlike the stone carvings of kings who wanted to be remembered forever. DNA does not care about politics. It does not care about empire. It does not care about what you want the story to be. It only tells the truth. Always. Without exception. Without mercy. So let us ask the question that geneticists asked when they first began studying the Colombian population in serious depth. The question seemed simple enough. Who are these people, really? On the surface, the answer looked obvious. Colombia was colonized by Spain beginning in the early 1500s. The Spanish brought African enslaved people in enormous numbers. And before all of that, the land was home to indigenous peoples. The Muisca, the Tairona, the Zenu, the Quimbaya, and dozens of other nations whose names most of the world has never heard. So the logical hypothesis was clear. Modern Colombians should be a mixture of three things: indigenous American DNA, Spanish European DNA, and West African DNA. Simple, clean, predictable. That was the expectation. That was the story the history books had already written before the science even began. But science has a habit of walking into a room, looking at the neat, clean story everyone has prepared, and flipping the table. Because when researchers began mapping the actual genetic landscape of Colombia, region by region, community by community, chromosome by chromosome, the first thing they noticed was that the mixture was not what anyone had predicted. Not in the proportions, not in the origins, and most shockingly of all, not in the survival rate of the indigenous genetic signal. Let us stop here for a moment, because this is important. Before the Spanish arrived, Colombia was not empty. It was not a wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a world, a full, breathing, complex, ancient world. The Muisca people alone, who lived on the high savanna plateau near what is now Bogota, had a civilization so sophisticated that their legend of El Dorado, the Golden Man, the king who covered himself in gold dust and bathed in a sacred lake, traveled across the ocean and drove European explorers absolutely mad with obsession for over a century. Think about that. The Muisca were so wealthy, so organized, so culturally powerful, that a single ritual of theirs became the most famous treasure myth in all of human history. And yet, when you ask most people today what they know about the Muisca, you get silence. That silence is the first crime in this story, and it gets deeper. Because the Muisca were not alone. Along the Caribbean coast, the Tairona built cities in the mountains, stone terraces, irrigation systems, roads carved into the Sierra Nevada, a civilization so advanced that archaeologists who first uncovered their ruins in the 20th century initially refused to believe that it was indigenous. They thought it had to be something else, something from outside. Because the idea that people in this part of the world had built something that elegant, that planned, that permanent, it did not fit the story that colonialism had spent 500 years writing. The Tairona city, known today as Ciudad Perdida, the Lost City, was built roughly 1,500 years ago. That means it was standing, thriving, and full of life 800 years before the first Spanish ship ever appeared on the horizon. 800 years. Let that number breathe for a moment. And then the Spanish came, and everything changed. Not slowly, not gently. With fire, with steel, with disease, and with a particular kind of violence that was not only physical, it was cultural, spiritual, linguistic, and genetic. The Spanish did not just conquer land, they conquered identity. They renamed rivers. They demolished temples and built churches on the same stones. They gave people new names, new gods, new languages, and new stories about who they were and where they came from. It was one of the most complete acts of cultural erasure in human history. And it worked. For a while. But here is what the colonizers did not know. Here is what they could not have known because the science did not exist yet. Every single person they conquered, every single person who survived, every single child born in the years and decades and centuries that followed, each one of them was carrying, deep inside their cells, a record that no priest could baptize away, no governor could legislate away, and no empire could burn away. The DNA was still there, quiet, patient, waiting, like a message sealed in a bottle, thrown into the ocean 500 years ago, finally washing up on the shore of a genetics laboratory. And when scientists opened that bottle, they found something extraordinary. The indigenous signal in Colombian DNA was not what anyone expected. In some regions of the country, particularly in the interior highlands and the Pacific coast and the Amazon basin, the indigenous genetic contribution was not small. It was enormous. In certain communities, it was dominant. Not a trace, not an echo, a living, breathing, statistically undeniable presence. Which meant that something deeply important had happened. The people had changed their language. They had changed their religion. They had changed their names, their clothing, their gods, their calendars, their music, at least on the surface. But their blood had not changed. Not completely. Not even close. Scientists have a term for this phenomenon. They call it elite dominance, or sometimes language replacement without population replacement. What it means in plain language is this: a small group of conquerors can impose their culture on a much larger group of people without actually replacing those people. The language changes, the religion changes, the names change, but the people, the actual biological human beings, they remain. Their DNA remains. Their genetic story continues, quietly, invisibly, underneath the new story that has been written on top of it. This is one of the most important and most underappreciated facts in all of Latin American history. And Colombia is one of its most powerful examples. Now let us go deeper, because the genetics of Colombia do not just reveal a story of survival. They reveal a story of astonishing complexity, a story that reaches back not 500 years, not 2,000 years, but tens of thousands of years. When researchers began analyzing the Y chromosome data, the genetic information passed only from father to son, generation after generation, an unbroken male line stretching back through time. They found haplogroups that told a very specific story. The dominant indigenous Y chromosome lineages in Colombia belong primarily to haplogroup Q, specifically QM3, which is considered one of the defining genetic markers of the first Americans. The people who carried this marker were among the earliest humans to ever set foot on the American continent. They crossed from Asia into what is now Alaska somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, walking across a land bridge that no longer exists, through a world covered in ice, in conditions that would kill most modern humans within days. And they kept walking, south, always south, through the forests and the mountains and the rivers, generation after generation, until some of them reached a narrow strip of land between two oceans, until some of them stopped and stayed, and became the ancestors of the people who would one day be called Colombian. That is not a small thing. That is not a footnote. That is the foundation of the entire story. And the foundation is not Spanish. It was never Spanish. But wait, because here is where the story takes a turn that even the researchers did not see coming. When they looked at the mitochondrial DNA, the genetic information passed only from mother to child, the female line, the maternal thread running through all of human history. The indigenous signal was even stronger. In some Colombian populations, the maternal haplogroups A, B, C, and D, all ancient American lineages, all descended from those first women who crossed the land bridge from Asia all those thousands of years ago, were present at rates that stunned the scientific community. In certain rural and indigenous communities, the maternal line was almost entirely pre-Columbian. Almost entirely. Which told a very specific and very painful story about what colonization actually looked like at the biological level. Because if the male European signal was present, but the female European signal was weak, that meant something. That meant the mixing happened in a particular direction. That meant the children of Colombia were, in enormous numbers, born from indigenous mothers. And who were their fathers? The answer to that question is one of the darkest chapters in the history of this continent, and it is written, permanently and without mercy, in the DNA. But let us slow down for a moment, because there is a word that scientists use when they talk about what happened to the indigenous genetic signal in Colombia, and that word is survival. Not disappearance, not replacement, survival. And survival in genetics is not a passive thing. It is not something that happens by accident. It is something that happens because of numbers, because of scale, because no matter how powerful a conquering force is, no matter how many soldiers it sends, no matter how many priests it deploys, no matter how many documents it signs and seals and stamps with official authority, it cannot outnumber an entire population. And the indigenous population of Colombia before the Spanish arrived was not small. Estimates vary, but serious researchers believe that somewhere between 1 million and 3 million people inhabited the territory of modern Colombia before 1500. Some estimates go even higher. These were not scattered bands of nomads. These were organized societies with cities and trade networks and political systems and religious institutions that had been functioning and evolving for thousands of years. And when the Spanish came with their diseases and their steel and their God, yes, the population collapsed, catastrophically, heartbreakingly. In some regions, 90% of the people died within a few generations. 90%. Let that number sit in your chest for a moment. 9 out of every 10 people. Gone, from disease mostly. Smallpox, measles, typhus. Diseases for which the indigenous immune system had zero preparation, zero defense. It was not a fair fight. It was a biological, not even a fight. It was a biological catastrophe of a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. And yet the 10% who survived, they carried everything. In their blood, in their mitochondria, in their Y chromosomes, in the quiet chemical library of their DNA, they carried the entire genetic history of a civilization that the Spanish thought they had erased. And those survivors had children. And those children had children. And those children had children. And here is the thing about genetics that no empire ever understood. 10% of 1 million people is still 100,000 people. 100,000 living human beings carrying ancient genetic information forward into the future. And over 5 centuries, 100,000 becomes 1 million, becomes 10 million, becomes part of the living genetic reality of a nation of 50 million. The math of survival is slow, but it is absolutely relentless. Now here is where the story takes another turn, because it is not just about who survived. It is about what they carried. And what the indigenous survivors of Colombia carried in their DNA was not just a record of their own people. It was a record of something far older, something that connects Colombia not just to its own pre-Columbian past, but to a story that began on the other side of the world, in the grasslands and forests of Central Asia, tens of thousands of years before the concept of Colombia existed in any human mind. Remember those ancient migrants we talked about, the ones who crossed the Bering Land Bridge through ice and darkness to reach the Americas? They did not come from nowhere. They were themselves the descendants of an even older migration, the great expansion of modern humans out of Africa that began roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago. Those African ancestors spread north and east across the Eurasian continent, developing along the way the specific genetic signatures, the haplogroups, that scientists can now read like a compass pointing back through time. The people who eventually crossed into the Americas were carrying in their bodies a genetic passport that said, "We came from East Asia, our deeper ancestors came from Central Asia, and before that, before all of that, the very foundation of what we are came from the African continent." Every Colombian citizen today, no matter how indigenous their heritage, carries at the absolute root of their genetic tree this ancient African origin. We are all, every single one of us, cousins in the deepest possible sense. The DNA says so, unambiguously, without exception. But let us come back to Colombia specifically, because the Colombian genetic story has a detail that many people do not know, and that detail involves not just who arrived, but when, and from where. Because the first humans to reach the territory of modern Colombia were not the Muisca, they were not the Tairona, they were not any of the civilizations that the Spanish would later encounter. The first humans in Colombia arrived somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. These were Paleo-Indian people, members of some of the earliest waves of human migration into South America. And the evidence for their presence is extraordinary. In the Serranía de la Lindosa region of the Colombian Amazon, there is a cliff face that stretches for nearly 13 kilometers. 13 kilometers. And that entire cliff face is covered, absolutely covered, in ancient paintings. Animals that no longer exist. Giant sloths, mastodons, paleohorses, ancient camelids, painted by human hands in red ochre at a time when these creatures were still alive. Scientists who have studied these paintings believe they were created roughly 12,500 years ago, which means that the first Colombians were not just surviving in this landscape. They were documenting it. They were creating art. They were recording the world around them with the same fundamental human impulse that drives a filmmaker to point a camera, a writer to pick up a pen, a geneticist to peer into a microscope. The desire to say, "I was here. This is what I saw. Remember this." And here is the most extraordinary part of this discovery. When geneticists compared the DNA of modern indigenous communities living near that cliff face with the ancient genetic signatures expected from Paleo-Indian populations, the connection was there. Faint, but real. A genetic echo, as scientists call it, stretching 12,000 years from those first painters to the people living in the same Amazon jungle today. 12,000 years of unbroken presence in the same landscape. 12,000 years of belonging to a place. And now the story shifts again. Because Colombia's genetic history is not just about the past. It is about a collision that is still happening. A conversation between ancient and modern that plays out every single day in the streets of Colombian cities, in the music that pours from open windows, in the food that fills Colombian markets, in the faces of Colombian children who carry in their cheekbones and their eyes and their skin the evidence of every single one of the great migrations we have described. Consider Colombian music for a moment. The cumbia, Colombia's most iconic musical export, the rhythm that traveled from Colombia to Mexico to Argentina and became the heartbeat of an entire continent, is itself a genetic story told in sound. Its percussion tradition comes from West African slaves. Its melodic gaita flute comes directly from indigenous Zenu culture, an instrument so old that versions of it have been found in pre-Columbian archaeological sites, dating back more than 2,000 years. Its formal structure and certain harmonic elements absorbed Spanish colonial influence. 3 migrations, 3 genetic streams, 1 musical form. When a Colombian musician plays cumbia, whether they know it or not, whether they think about it or not, they are performing the genetic history of their nation. They are letting the DNA sing, and the food. The Colombian diet is itself a genetic map. Corn, a crop domesticated by indigenous Mesoamerican civilizations and spread south by ancient trade networks long before the Spanish arrived. Yucca, one of the oldest cultivated plants in the Americas, grown in Colombia for thousands of years. Ajiaco, the traditional Bogotá soup made from 3 different types of potato, an indigenous crop, combined with herbs that grow only on the Andean Paramo, a recipe so tied to the specific altitude and ecology of the Colombian highlands that it could only have been born here, in this specific landscape, by people who knew this land deeply and intimately, the way only thousands of years of belonging can produce. When a modern Colombian family sits down to eat ajiaco, they are consuming a dish that contains the knowledge of their Muisca ancestors, as surely as their blood contains their Muisca DNA. And then there is the architecture. Look at the oldest neighborhoods of Bogotá, Cartagena, Popayan. The white colonial buildings, the Baroque churches, the Spanish tile roofs. The surface is European, unmistakably. But look at the foundations. Look at what the buildings are built on. In some cases, literally on top of indigenous ceremonial platforms. In others, built using indigenous construction knowledge that the Spanish did not have. Techniques for building on unstable Andean slopes. Drainage systems that echoed Muisca water management. Alignment with astronomical features that indigenous architects had been calculating for centuries. The Spanish brought the surface. The indigenous knowledge built the foundation. And again, the genetic metaphor is perfect. European cultural forms on top, indigenous genetic reality underneath, holding everything up, invisible but essential. And now we must talk about something that genetics has revealed, which changes everything. Something that historians argued about for decades, that politicians tried to control the narrative of, that the Catholic Church preferred to leave unexamined, and that DNA settled in a matter of years with the cold, patient precision of pure science. We must talk about what actually happened between the Spanish colonizers and the indigenous and African women of Colombia. Because the genetic asymmetry we described earlier, the strong European male Y chromosome signal combined with the overwhelming indigenous and African female mitochondrial signal, is not just a scientific curiosity. It is a testimony. It is evidence. Written in the bodies of 50 million living people, it tells a story about power and vulnerability and survival that no colonial document ever recorded honestly. The Spanish men came. The Spanish women, in the early decades of colonization, largely did not. And the children born in those early generations were born from indigenous and African mothers. Mothers who did not choose this. Mothers who survived anyway. Mothers who passed forward not just their mitochondrial DNA, but their languages in secret, their recipes in kitchens, their knowledge of plants and seasons and stars whispered to children who were being raised to speak Spanish and pray to a foreign god. The genetic record does not just show survival, it shows the specific mechanism of survival. It shows us that the women were the keepers. They always were. And this brings us to one of the most profound concepts in modern genetic anthropology: the idea that culture and blood can diverge completely, that a people can change everything visible about themselves and preserve everything invisible. Scientists call this phenomenon language shift without population replacement. But in Colombia, it was not just language that shifted. It was religion. It was name. It was cosmology. It was the entire framework through which a person understood their place in the universe. The Muisca did not stop being Muisca because they were baptized with Spanish names. The Zenu did not stop being Zenu because their children learned to read in Spanish. The Afro-Colombian communities on the Pacific coast did not stop being the carriers of West